Hello guys, welcome back to my video series on the derivation of the black Scholes. In the previous video, we talked about financial derivatives and specifically option contracts in the form of calls and puts. So calls, and then we also have puts. Cool, so we talked about the definition of what a call is and what a put is. And in this video, I'll go over a real world example, or somewhat of a real world example of how these contracts could play out for both a buyer and a seller. So to do this, we'll start with call options, draw a little graph, and then let's say we have a strike price K, and this is going to be at $110. And we have a stock price and two dotted lines. And then this is going to be our final time T where our option expires. Cool. So within this, our stock could take many forms. So one such path could be like this. Maybe our stock happens to end up over here. Maybe another could end up over here. Cool. So let's say this ends up at $100. And this is the final price for, let's call it SF stock price final one. This is $110, stock price final two, and this is, let's say, $130. It's probably not to scale, but that's okay. Stock price final three. Cool. And again, this is the time axis, and this is our stock price. And let's also set a premium price, and let's say that's going to be $5 per share. Now let's see how this plays out for our buyers and our sellers. So let's say we have a buyer, and we have a seller, and then we have the initial time and then the final time for our buyer, the initial time and the final time for the seller. So let's start with SFF1. This is the simplest one, where the stock price ends below the strike price K. So at time 0, and this may vary for, or this does vary for American options. This is specifically for European options where you can't exercise this early. But essentially in the beginning, the buyer is going to pay the premium to enter this contract to the seller. So $5 per share, and every contract is consisting of 100 shares. So the buyer is going to lose 500 initially, and the seller is going to gain 500. Now the option expires below the strike price, so at the final time there's no transaction happening. This option expires worthless. So in this case, the seller wins, where he profits $500 and then the buyer is down $500. Now let's look at S of F2. So in the same way, in the initial case, to enter the contract, there's the transaction of $500 from the buyer to the seller. And then it expires at $110. But the buyer could have just bought the shares at 110 at time T. So there's no value in his option exercising. So essentially, he's not really going to gain any money. So let's just say plus 0 and minus 0. And the seller still comes out on top with plus $500. Now the third case is a little more interesting. So this is SFF3. Initially it starts with minus $500 and plus $500, the initial transaction to enter the contract. And there's a difference of $20 over here. So essentially what happens is the seller will sell 100 shares at $110. And the buyer will buy those shares for obviously $110, even though the stock price is at $130. So that would mean that for every share the buyer is making $20 profit. And since there's 100 shares, the buyer will profit $2,000. And the seller will be negative $2,000. So in this case, the buyer comes out to a profit of $1,500, and the seller comes out to negative $1,500. So in this case, the buyer is going to win. Now we can use the same exact example for puts. So I will draw this out. And let's say there's a K-strike price over here. And let's say this is at $100. And then this is my final time T. Cool. And now my stock price can take many paths. And let's say this is going to be my SFF1. And in the same case, say this is my SFF2. And this is going to be my SFF3. So it goes down here. This is my SFF2. So let's say SFF1 ends at $85. SFF2 ends, let's say, at $99. And SFF3 ends at $120. And the premium for this, we're going to say, is $2 per share. So in the same way, we're going to have a buyer for this put option, and we're going to have a seller for this put option. And there's the cases of the initial time and final time. And we have the initial time for the seller and the final time for the seller. And let's analyze case SFF1. So initially, the buyer is going to pay $200 or $2 per share to the seller as the premium. So the buyer is down 200 and then the seller is up 200. Now at the final time, the buyer is going to buy 100 shares of an $85 stock at the strike price K, which is 100. So there's a difference over here of 15. And when he does that, obviously, the buyer is going to make a profit of 100 shares at $15 each, which means he will be up 1,500 and the seller will be down negative 1,500. So in this case, the buyer will come out on top. He will be positive and then the seller will be negative. Now, let's look at SFF2. So in the same way, the buyer will be down initially $200 and the seller will be up $200. And now there's a $1 difference. And essentially but it's still in the money. So the buyer will profit 100 shares of a $1 difference. And that's going to be plus 100 and minus 100. So this is an interesting case because even though the option expired in the money and it expired below the strike price K, essentially what that means, the buyer still comes out negative and the seller wins just because the premium of $200 was chosen in a way such that the seller has more free area to come out on top. Now, if it expired at, for example, $98 and not $99, then both of them would break even. So if I were to do an example of that, I'll say this is SFF4, for example. And I just want to analyze that real quick. SFF4 would be negative 200 plus 200. And since it expired in the money with a $2 difference, $2, 100 shares, so the buyer will profit 200 and the seller will sell those shares or buy those shares from the buyer of the contract, and they would both net zero profit. And then just to demonstrate the last example, SFF3, initially there's negative 200 for the premium transaction from the buyer to the seller. And since the option expires out of the money, it's not below the K strike price, then the option expires worthless. So in this case, the seller still comes out on top. Cool. So these are a few examples of how options can play out in the real world. Obviously, there's a whole options chain, and with many different strike prices that you can choose from, each with different premiums. And associated with all of these, there's also something called a payoff ratio, which I'll be discussing in the next video.